Okay, folks, without any further ado, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Carl Craver. Carl's been visiting us here at the Rotman for the last couple of days, and we've been really thrilled to have him around. He does the kind of work that we aspire to. It straddles the sciences of the mind in Carl's instance, and philosophy. He gave a great talk yesterday over the way. We're expecting him to live up to his own high standards today. So without any further ado, Carl Craver on network models and the ontic account on scientific explanation.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Thanks a lot. This has really been a wonderful couple of days hanging out with you and talking and getting to know you and learning what you all are doing. It's really just incredibly interesting stuff. Yesterday was a talk that I thought was that really is intended for a very wide audience. Today I'm a little concerned that I think this could also be pretty broad. But we are going to get into some issues in philosophy of science. Nothing especially weighty, but that's the centerpiece of all of this, is to ask how the view of explanation that I've been putting together for several years fits together, a mechanistic view of explanation, fits together with recent developments where people are using network mathematics to describe various kinds of systems. It seems to me that it's a feature of contemporary philosophy of science, for whatever reason, that whenever scientists invent a new way of representing things, the philosophers start championing it as an entirely new way of explaining stuff, and that it somehow contrasts with old ways of doing things. And often the term mechanism is used as a term of derision to describe the old way of doing things that we're now kicking to the curb and moving on to the new stuff. But my claim is that, in fact, that's overhyped, and that it's overhyped in many different contexts, and this is a context where I think it's overhyped as well. And I'll try to make that story sound somewhat convincing, just to give you some sense that I'm not just talking that I'm not just making things up. I did spend a year working with Steve Peterson, who's one of the people who's applying network analysis to resting state functional connectivity of the brain and churning these kinds of models on computers. And so I do have some sense of what I'm talking about here, though not as much as people who actually do this for a living. I'll try to make it as intelligible as I can to you. So network analysis really is just a mathematics of pairwise relations. That's what it is. And if you could get Newman's book on this thing, he'll describe all kinds of equations that will be used to describe things that look roughly like these pictures that are taken from the classic Wolf and Stogatz paper that you have to cite and put as your first slide whenever you talk about networks. This way of talking about things provides us with a set of classifications of, for instance, different kinds of networks. This paper made famous the idea that there are small world networks and that those are different from random networks down here or regular networks up here. And we can also talk about different concepts. We have different concepts that we can apply to describe this kind of network structure. So we can talk about their modularity, the extent of their modularity, their clustering coefficient, their path coefficients, things like that, which are terms that we can use to describe different aspects of how these networks are organized. There's also a mathematics that goes along with it that allows us to prove formal results about networks. So given that it's a small world network, you can prove that, for instance, it's more robust to random attack than, for example, a random network or a regular network, although those proofs are controversial. And then I think really what's going to be important by the end of my talk today is that it provides a set of algorithms that one can use to sort through very complicated data and to analyze that data and to detect in that data various kinds of network properties, like the clustering, what things cluster with one another, how path link is affected by changing different sorts of things in the system. And that's going to be very important to what I talk about today. So just for those of you, yep, this is what happens when you decide to put something on the wrong machine. You see, this is a lovely picture that walks you through the various concepts that are important here. What should be here is a tutorial in which we've got a matrix over here and the picture of a network over here, and then there are various concepts. What I was going to try to do here was to introduce things like nodes of especially high degree, which are connected with other nodes next to them by a number of different connections, or to talk about things like clustering coefficient, how interconnected a set of nodes are, and this idea of modules and things that are between modules, like hubs, And I was going to show how those are that can be represented in a matrix that's going to appear as this talk goes on. But we'll have other examples of that in just a second, and I'll be able to explain that to you, I think. Now, this way of describing things has become incredibly popular, not just in the neurosciences and at multiple levels in the neurosciences or in genetics, but it's used to describe Facebook and the internet and movie databases and dolphin communication and karate dojos. Apparently, people who do karate really care about who trained who, and they've mapped this out for generations upon generations. And then you can tell like who clusters together into groups of a certain kind of karate or something like that. You can use it to describe gene regulatory networks and so on. And finally, there are ways, most importantly, I think, there are ways of talking about indie bands and their relationship to one another and whether they've shared members and that kind of thing, and movie databases. How far are we from Kevin Bacon? And we've all played that kind of game. This can be also applied at many different scales of analysis. So part of what I'm trying to prime in you is the thought that this is a very general abstract framework that can be applied to many different kinds of things. It's content neutral in many respects. What you need is a bunch of nodes and a bunch of connections between them. In neuroscience, I think we could talk about it, applying it to gene regulatory networks, where I think it's doing quite a bit of work. But the two places that it's starting to really show up for those of us who are interested in brain systems are in cell-to-cell connections. For instance, people like Lichtman and Sains, who are interested in mapping out every connection of every cell to every other cell in some area of the brain, or Sebastian Sung, who's crowdsourcing the mapping of the mouse retina and trying to capture every synapse in the mouse retina through this project. And really what I was working on was this large-scale brain system stuff, which is up above that level and is now looking at resting state functional imaging, which I'll say more about in just a second, and trying to apply this network mathematics to that resting state data in order to find out what systems of the brain hang together, roughly. All right? As I said, we could do it at the cellular level. This would be the kind of thing that you'd have in mind. For instance, we can map out the entire connectome of C. elegans, get all of these different connections with one another, and then prove things about the structure of this, or find structure within it by applying those algorithms. As I said, it's being crowdsourced. And this is the kind of thing that Obama initially said that he was going to fund, to throw a bunch of resources into in order to get more money to do the recordings and mappings that are required to make this kind of project work. But what I'm into is the systems level stuff. And there we're not talking about cells. We're talking about things like voxels or 20 millimeter spheres of brain tissue. Right? We're not talking about anything that has a functional integrity of its own. It's rather a representational format that we've imposed upon the brain. But we can nonetheless still talk about how the activation in these different areas is related to one another using this network analysis. Again, more about that coming soon. Now, as I said, in philosophy, every new development is a new kind of explanation, it turns out, and I think that's false. The first question that we have to answer, I think, is, are network models explanatory? Right? And I'm going to say that's a bad question, and I'll tell you why. The second one is, do network models provide non-mechanistic explanations? That is the way that they provide explanations somehow a break from traditional ways of understanding the world in terms of revealing its causal structure? And my argument, I'll consider three cases that people have made, that it deals with abstraction and therefore is non-mechanistic, that it deals with non-decomposable systems and therefore is non-mechanistic, or that it's distinctively mathematical in some sense and therefore non-mechanistic. And I'll argue that each of those fails. All right? And then I'll say, so what are they good for? And then I'll say, like, not everything that's new in neuroscience and not everything that's really exciting in neuroscience and not everything that's really productive in neuroscience is a new kind of explanation. And I'll try to tell you what they're really doing with this stuff so that we don't mistake these really wonderful advances for something that, for making philosophical lessons that they do not in fact contain. Right? Okay. Are network models explanatory? Sorry, I do get slightly grumpy about this because as the token mechanist, I'm the guy who gets cited in the first page of any paper that claims that we've now moved beyond mechanism. And so I've read a million versions of this. And so if I look slightly like, that's the reason. I think this is a really bad question. And what makes people ask this question is that I think they embrace what I call a representational view of explanation. That whether something's an explanation or not depends on how you represent it. Right? That the explanatory force of a model lies in its representational form. And so when you shift the representational form, you're shifting the kind of explanation because you're now appealing to different explanatory features in your model. In contrast, embrace what I call an ontic view. I take this language from Salmon. It's caused me no end of pain to associate myself with this view. But according to this view, the explanatory force of a model doesn't come from the representational form of it, but rather in what the model represents, the referent of the model. And when we're building philosophical theories of explanation, our philosophical theories are not, what is the form in which I should represent this thing? The question is rather, what should this thing represent? That's the right question. That's the question that I think Hempel was focused on. I think it's the question that Salmon was focused on, and it's the question that I'm focused on, because that's where the norms for sorting good and bad explanations come from. Now, I don't mean to suggest by that I don't think that rendering things intelligible is an important feature of scientific models. Of course it is. Or that simplicity is sometimes important in scientific models. Of course it is. Or that different kinds of scientific models allow us to make most conspicuous different kinds of features of the system. Of course it is. And that's part of what's really cool about network explanation. My claim is that what imbues those things with explanatory force ultimately comes from the fact that they describe the right kinds of things in the world. And you can use network models to describe stuff that would be explanatory, and you can use network models to describe things that would not be explanatory, and for that reason, network models by themselves are not, you can't answer the question, are they explanatory or not, until you say what the network model is being used to do. It's a simple point, but I think it's one that's often lost in this literature. All right? Network theory, as I pointed out before, is content neutral. What you need is a bunch of nodes and a bunch of edges. So I think asking the question, is network model explanatory, is like, are algebraic models explanatory? Or is geometry explanatory? Is the first order predicate calculus explanatory? Well, you can't answer that question because you have to say, well, what are you representing in first order predicate calculus? What are you representing with your algebra? And if you're representing the wrong stuff, it ain't explanatory, right? And I'm after the stuff that it has to represent to count as explanatory. Whether the network model counts as explanatory depends on what the nodes and edges represent. All right? Who would disagree with that? Well, here's Bill Bechtel, who's made quite a bit of hay out of this in the recent past. Providing explanations, including mechanistic explanations, he says, is essentially a cognitive activity. This is particularly obvious when one considers incorrect mechanistic explanations, which I claim are not explanations. In such cases, one is still appealed to a mechanism, but not one operative in nature. I would call those false, and so not explanatory in virtue of their falseness. He says, another way to appreciate the point is to note that in many instances, the mechanism in question was operative long before scientists discovered the mechanism and invoked it to explain the phenomenon. That's true, and our goal in science is to discover those. Right? Thus, since explanation is an epistemic activity, what figures in it are not mechanisms in the world, but representations of them. But I don't understand how the epistemic work could do anything unless it's describing the right kind of stuff. So the epistemic relationship between the explanans and the explanandum is only going to count as doing explanatory work when the relationship between what the explanans describes and what the explanandum describes is of the right sort. Right? Two of the major legacies, he says, of the DN model are the assumptions that the primary mode of representing explanation is propositional and that logic provides the tools for reasoning about these representations. That is, when Bill objects to the DN model, he's objecting to it as using the wrong representational format. It's putting things in first-order predicate calculus, but we now know that brains don't work that way and minds don't work that way. It's not first-order predicate calculus. It's activation vectors or some other sort of mental models or something like that. And for me, that's just the wrong way to attack Hempel. Hempel didn't care how you represented the arguments. His claim was that he had a rule for saying when explanations are good. What's wrong with Hempel is that you can form DN model explanations that aren't explanatory because they don't describe the right kind of stuff. I'll say more about that in just a second. All right, so let's move on to a better question. Do network models provide non-mechanistic explanations, like allow us to explain in ways that causal mechanical things do not? Here I think there's also a mistaken assumption. The kinds of explanation are distinguished by the representational format of the explanatory text. So sometimes people claim, for instance, that if you've got a dynamical model, that can't be mechanistic. But of course you can use a dynamical model to describe how the components in a mechanism interact with one another. But you can use dynamical models to describe all kinds of stuff. And when it doesn't describe those kinds of causal interactions, then you start wondering whether it's actually explanatory. But when it does, then you say, oh yeah, it's explanatory, but it's explanatory in virtue of the fact that it describes the causal structure of the system. Or computational explanation, geometrical explanation, and the same point can be iterated time and again. The alternative, I've said already, is that kinds of scientific explanation are distinguished by the reference. Now, am I being some kind of imperialist here? You only count as explanatory if you actually describe the causal structure or describe mechanisms, and I'm just insisting that the only way to explain something is by describing causes and mechanisms, like a small child who can't imagine other forms of explaining things. No, that's actually not the view that I've got. If we want to explain why Obama can sign treaties, it's not a causal mechanical explanation. If you want to explain why it's wrong to kill young children with no good reason, that's not going to be a causal mechanical explanation. And I think there are other forms of explanation that we can give. The only thing that we should demand as philosophers is that if you claim that there's something new under the explanatory sun, you should be able to tell us what the rules are that sort the good versions of that kind of explanation from the bad versions of that kind of explanation. And my claim about these uses of network analysis is the ones that we want to count as explanatory are the ones that actually get at the causal structure. Now maybe it's the case. Maybe it's the case that there is a form of network explanation, but if somebody wants to make that case, the case will have to be made by spelling out what the rules are that sort network explanations from network non-explanations, and those can't reduce to the claim that the network explanations that are truly explanatory are the ones that get the causal structure right, and the ones that aren't are the ones that do something else. So a better question, it seems to me, is does network representation afford a means of representing non-mechanistic explanations? And that would be an interesting question that I would love to see addressed. But so far in the literature, I haven't seen anyone address that question. Here's the category mistake that I think is going on. You want to find a revolution in music? By the way, I gave this talk in Berlin a while ago, and somebody really called me on this one. But maybe you can get the point that I'm trying to make anyhow. I think this, if anything, counts as a revolution in music. The move from ABBA to the Ramones does. All right? The move from the cassette tape to the CD is not by itself a revolution in music. It's a revolution in music storage. Now, somebody pointed out that, of course, this move made possible all kinds of stuff. And certainly, we should allow the same thing for network analysis. But if it's going to count as a new kind of thing, then we have to say what this made possible and then show that it's revolutionary at this level. And so I think when people say that networks allow us to give new kinds of explanation, they're really talking about something like this rather than something like this. Okay. So one thing that's helpful here to keep in mind, and this is a distinction that was drawn by my colleague and collaborator who's actually still looking for a job, and he's really excellent, Eric Hochstein, 2015, this paper in Philosophy of Science. He describes a difference between something that's a mechanistic model and something that's a model of a mechanism. Right? A mechanistic model, and this is the way that Bill Bechtel has often talked about these things. It's like a mousetrap. It begins at the beginning, and then it triggers the next stage, and that triggers the next stage, and it's linear, and it's always very simple. And it explicitly represents the parts and the activities and the organization of some mechanism. And you might draw it in a diagram or write a paragraph in which you describe the various steps of the thing. And that's modeling the system as a mechanism. And it's making its parts explicit and its interactions explicit and its organization explicit. And there the emphasis is on what you're putting in the model and how you're representing it. On the other hand, you could have a model of a mechanism that isn't like that. A model that, for instance, mathematically characterizes the relationships between the variables that describe the components in the mechanism. Dynamical models, I think, work like that in many cases. Right? It's a model that has explanatory force in virtue of representing some aspect of the mechanism, its organization or its working, but it need not represent that explicitly as the mechanistic model does. Now notice that what I've done is really just shifted over here to a kind of ontic emphasis. Right? It's about the referent, not about the form of the representation. So I think a better question here is, do network models allow us to represent non-mechanistic yet explanatory relations? And that's a really good question. But in order to do that, we have to show that it's non-mechanistic in the end. All right. A network model of mechanisms, for example. Here's one. I mean, this isn't a mechanism, by the way. This is just like every cell in C. elegans. Right? That's not a mechanism. It's a model. It's a network model. I don't think it's designed to explain anything. It's designed to represent how these things are connected to one another. But it doesn't show how anything works or how anything gets done. It's just a representation of how the things hang together. So here we've got a bunch of nodes. Those are the cells. We've got synapses between them. Those could be the edges in this thing. And there we're just getting a kind of spatial organization among these things. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. We all know that there are these people who build things like causal Bayes nets. Right? And there you can have nodes that are variables and edges that are causal relationships between things. And in those cases, you're representing the causal structure of the system by, in nodes and arrows, the same nodes and arrows in a way, but they're interpreted in an entirely different way. So why do people think this is different? Well, Bill says, Bechtel and Levy argue, that network models provide abstract explanations. That they drop a bunch of detail and just focus on, for instance, the cell and its connection to the other cell, and dropping all the other details about the cells or the nature of the connections or what neurotransmitters are involved. They're just getting at an abstract structure in a way. So they appeal to Yuri Alon's work on different taxonomies of different kinds of networks that one finds in motifs throughout the biological sciences and that have been repeated in various different kinds of explanations. Like one of them is like this. And Bechtel and Levy want to say, oh, there's an explanation of something. Something about how Z changes, perhaps. Right? And I'm not sure why they think I should object to that. Every model of everything is abstract. There are no to be a model of something is to abstract from the details. And so there are no models that aren't, it's in some sense, abstract. Oh, sorry, maybe I'm making that claim too strong. But at least every model I know of involves some amount of abstraction. And so contrasting mechanistic models with the abstract ones is it's just a false contract. We're all abstract. And one thing that I would insist upon is I think this might, in fact, describe something really useful about the organization of a system, about how the variables causally interact with one another and how they're organized. And when we talked about mechanistic explanation, we always said that the point is to say how different things interact with one another and how they're organized. And so this model reveals something about the causal structure of the system. And for a mechanist to explain something just is to show how something is situated in the causal structure of the world. And abstract models are often really useful for showing how things are situated in the causal structure of the world. Part of what's happened, and there's a sociological explanation for this, and I'll be happy to tell you it if you allow me to buy you a drink later this evening. But I've become associated with the claim that more details are always better in an explanation. I think partly it's just because the word mechanism seems to suggest to people that you're always tunneling down, down, down until the rubber really hits the road at parts that actually physically contact one another or something like that. Of course, that's not the view of explanation or mechanism that I've ever embraced, but it has a guilt by free association, I suppose. For instance, Jim Woodward claims that in the case of mechanistic explanations in biology, these writers, Craver, 2011 and 2006, emphasize the importance of providing very specific, concrete details concerning, for example, molecular interactions and their spatiotemporal organization. For such writers, dynamical systems theory and other more abstract forms of biological theorizing do not, in the absence of molecular or other sorts of low-level detail, provide mechanistic explanations or indeed explanations of any kind at all. That's just false as a characterization of the view. Again, it's about revealing the causal structure of the system. And just, you don't have to take my word on it. This is from the 2006 paper that he's citing here. Few models are actually isomorphic with the phenomenon, given that models typically abstract away from the precise details of the system being modeled, that they typically are only approximate, and that they make simplifying assumptions in order to apply a particular formalism. It's explicit. Or down here, the idea of an ideally complete how-actually model, one that includes all of the relevant causes and components in a given mechanism, no matter how remote, negligible, or tiny, without abstraction or idealization, is a philosopher's fiction. science would be strikingly inefficient and useless, both for human understanding and for practical application, if it dealt in such painstaking minutiae. It's not a fight. All right, so let's turn to something more productive. Non-decomposability of mechanisms. Here, Rathkopf has this lovely article in 2014 in which he says that what's really cool about mechanistic explanation is that it provides something non-mechanistic. And I agree with many of the things that he says, but I just want to nitpick slightly. He draws two contrasts between network explanation and what I do. He says, rather than using idealizing techniques, notice he's moving in exactly the opposite direction of Bechtel. Rather than using idealizing techniques to strip these properties away, he says, as is standard practice in other areas of science, network science brings them to the fore and uses them to furnish forms of explanation. So network explanations give you more details on Rathkopf's view, right? And that's actually true. So if you're doing epidemiology and you do it without paying attention to like population structure, for example, like who is likely to be a super spreader, or who's an airline steward, or those are the kinds of things that you need to pay attention to. And when you build that stuff into the models work differently, right? So adding that kind of detail, adding more detail of that sort actually enriches the story that you can tell and makes your models better in many ways. But there's something right about the idea that that it does allow us to give us that sort of complexity. But as I said, all models are abstract. And even when I represent a population in terms of super spreaders, et cetera, I'm not telling you what clothes they're wearing or how they got to the airport or any of that. I just care about their likelihood of running into one another and passing diseases from one to another. And I drop everything else about them out of the picture. He says the second claim in this article is that network representations are particularly helpful in explaining the properties of non-decomposable systems. Where part-whole decomposition is not possible, network science provides an alternative method to explaining system behavior. And I think there's something right about that as well. But I think there's also something slightly confused in this way of formulating the contrast. And I'll have to bring that out this way. When we talk about community structure in a network, we're really talking about something that Herbert Simon introduced a long time ago, which is the idea of near decomposability. The idea that you can break a system into parts, and John Hoagland said that one of the ways of rendering something intelligible is by breaking a complicated system into parts that are more or less isolated from one another, and then understanding how those parts interact with one another. And in network science, that's exactly what we're going to try to do. We're going to take a very messy causal network, and then we're going to be able to, in many cases, carve community structure out of that complicated network. Very few networks lack community structure. Regular networks, but random networks are going to have some community structure in the sense that Simon had in mind. Networks that don't have any decomposable substructure are really quite rare in nature. And I think that what's really interesting about these cases where we're actually using network analysis on a real-world system is not that suddenly the thing isn't decomposable into community structure. It's rather that it is, but that we have to kind of squint at it to see that community structure. And representing that community structure is important. So this is just the idea that we're going to carve systems at their joints, which means we want cases where the causal interactions among the components are much greater or stronger than the ones between those components and things outside of the system. And what I'm describing here is really just what a network scientist is going to talk about as a module or a community within a network. Right? That's the Hoagland quote. Okay? So I think that what Rathkopf gets wrong is that network analysis isn't just useful for describing things that are completely regular networks. What's really cool about network analysis is that it gives us a vocabulary for describing the whole spectrum of near decomposability, from things that are really modular in their organization to things that are really non-modular in their organization, and to everything that's kind of a smear in between, to capture the full spectrum of decomposability of systems. But the other thing that I would point out is that if we've built a network out of causal relationships, so that the nodes are variables and the arrows are causal interactions between them, at the very base of this thing, we've still got parts causally interacting with one another. Now, and in that sense, it's a mechanism in my view. It involves causal to provide such a model is to show how something is situated in the causal structure of the world. the question that Rathkoff is pointing to is whether there is some sort of, there's intermediate levels of decomposition between that very base level and the highest level that we're interested in. And degrees of near decomposability will show up as degrees to which we can identify that sort of intermediate causal structure. I hope I'm making that reasonably clear. But so I think the real question is how much intermediate mechanistic organization we can find, not whether there's mechanistic organization simpliciter. That's at the base level if we're dealing with a causal network in the first place. So is it a distinctively mathematical kind of explanation? This, I think, gets really interesting. And I think there's a lot of work to be done here in the philosophy of science. And I don't want to make any final pronouncements about this one. But some people, like Hünemann, has this lovely paper in 2011 where he says that explanation goes like the relationship of entailment between topological properties and the thing to be explained, or features of the thing to be explained, and not like the display of a mechanism from which the thing to be explained would be the temporal outcome. He says, in my view, and this is similar to what Mark Lang wrote in this other really cool paper on mathematical, what he calls distinctively mathematical explanations. He says, in my view, the order of causal priority is not responsible for the order of explanatory priority in distinctively mathematical explanations. Rather, the facts doing the explaining are eligible to explain by virtue of being modally more necessary even than ordinary causal laws, or being understood in the why questions context as constitutive of the physical task or arrangement at issue. What these people have in mind is that you get the network structure of a system, and now you can derive consequences of its having that network structure, and that explanation now is working at a mathematical level, not in virtue of revealing the causal structure of the thing. Here's a kind of example that people often trot out for this purpose. You want to know, this is the Königsberg Bridge case. You want to know why can't I go walking around Königsberg in 18 whenever and hit all of the bridges exactly once? And this was a puzzle that was posed, and I think Euler eventually solves this problem, finds a way to solve the problem. And Hünemann, in that somewhat ornate passage that I just read you, really has in mind some structure like what I've represented here on the left. There's an empirical premise where you say, look, the bridges of Königsberg are just laid out like a connected network. They form a connected network. That is, every node has a connection to something else, some other node in the network. That has 4 nodes, and 3 of those nodes have 3 edges, and 1 of them has 5. That's just an empirical description of the layout of Königsberg, and we've now mapped it onto a network story. Then there's a mathematical premise that among connected networks composed of 4 nodes, only networks containing 0 or 2 nodes with an odd degree contain Eulerian paths. And then we draw the conclusion there's no Eulerian path around the bridges of Königsberg. And so the explanatory work here is it's not that somehow this is causing you to be unable to do it. It's just you can't do it because of the topological structure of Königsberg. Right? Now, one thing that I want to point out, everyone here who does philosophy of science has seen explanations that look like this before. They're called covering law explanations. We all know what happened to those, right? And I just want to remind us what happened to those, because it's an important lesson here, I think, as well. This is what happened to those. Flagpoles and shadows happened to those. And a million other barometers and storms happened to those, and et cetera, et cetera. You got the laws, you got the conditions, you got the explanandum phenomenon. Light travels at straight lines. Theta over here is 70 degrees. The height of the flagpole is 10 meters. X has to be 8.19 meters. That's how the length of the shadow. But of course, we all know that we can turn that thing around, and now we can write an argument in which we describe this law, and we give this angle, and we give the length of x, and we get the height of the flagpole, but nobody thinks that the height of the flagpole is explained by the elevation of the sun and the rectilinear propagation of light. The explanation goes in the wrong direction. And these kinds of examples were used time and time again to beat the covering law model into submission, and to claim really fundamentally that it was missing something. And what it was missing was the idea that there's a direction to explanation, an asymmetry of explanation. And that asymmetry, Salmon claimed, was provided by causal direction. Right? We can do the same thing here. So let's imagine that my friend Marta goes to Königsberg and takes a stroll and hits all the bridges exactly once. Right? Königsberg bridges form a connected network with 4 nodes, and Marta walked an Eulerian path through town. And among the connected networks composed of 4 nodes, only networks containing 0 or 2 nodes with odd degree also contain an Eulerian path. Therefore, either 0 or 2 of Königsberg's landmasses have an odd number of bridges. So Marta's little stroll around town explains the topological structure of Königsberg, which is the wrong way. She doesn't have anything to do with it. Now, it might be the case that the mayor of town, after having taken an Eulerian walk with Marta before she left, got so angry that he started destroying bridges. And then Marta's walk does, in fact, explain the structure of Königsberg, but that's a different story, and it's a causal story. Right? That's just aping von Frossen's attempt to undo the flagpole in the shadow case. Why do these guys owe an answer to that question? Well, they say that they owe us an answer to that question. Lang in his paper says, my account aims to fit scientific practice by deeming to be explanatory only hypotheses that would, if true, constitute genuine scientific explanations. And now we've got a case of topological explanation that does exactly the opposite of that. He says, my account aims to show how, to specify how distinctively mathematical explanations work, that is, to identify the source of their explanatory power. But if he can't distinguish the 2 flippable cases, then he hasn't got an account of the explanatory power. The norms of explanation have gone wanting, just as they did for the covering law model years and years ago. This is a problem for all of his examples. He has a really great case where dad can't distribute 23 cookies evenly among the twins. Because 23 is not divisible by 2, and there's a distinctively mathematical explanation. But now imagine that dad has a bunch of cookies and distributes them equally among the 2 kids. That means that dad must have started with an even number of cookies, and we can derive the fact that he started with an even number of cookies from the fact that he distributed them equally among the twins. But we don't explain why he had an even number of cookies to start with by the fact that the twins got equal amounts in the end. Same sort of story. So the moral is that you can subsume a phenomenon under a general model without explaining it. Not all patterns are explanatory. Scientists use models for a million different reasons. Not all of them are intended to be explanations. They're intended to represent stuff or to summarize data. Or they play many different roles besides giving explanations. And I think we philosophers sometimes lose sight of that. We're kind of explanation-centric. I'm guilty of that as well, I suppose. But ontic constraints in these cases seem to be crucial. Are they causally related to one another? Are they constitutive related to one another? Are they descriptions of the structure of the system that make possible certain causal interactions and not others? Those are the kinds of things that seem to me to sort the good uses, the explanatory uses of network models, sorry, not the good ones, the explanatory uses of network models from the non-explanatory uses, and there could be plenty of non-explanatory uses that are perfectly useful, but not explanatory. And that's really where I want to end. So let me give you a real example of something where I think scientists build a model that's totally useful and not explanatory. It wasn't even intended to do that. So here I'm going to talk about resting state functional connectivity. Everyone in here is certainly used to functional magnetic resonance imaging where you do subtraction or something like that. This is where you study blood oxygenation at rest. You have people lay in a scanner, and really you're looking at what was, in this condition, the control, the bottommost control. But you're now making it the data that's the primary focus of your attention. They just lay in the scanner, and you just watch changes in blood oxygenation as they lay there, hopefully very still. And then you collect this data for every voxel in the brain, 3 millimeter cube, right? Then you filter out all of the signals that you're getting out of this, except for those signals with periods between 10 and 100 seconds. Right? So now we're dealing with very slow wave changes in the bold signal. Not the kinds of things that would be happening as you're doing math. Very slow wave fluctuations in the bold signal between these different areas. Then what we're going to do, I'll walk through this in some pictures in just a second, is determine the correlation coefficients for each voxel. So you get the time course of that blood oxygenation signal, and then you ask, how correlated are the time courses of these fluctuations in these different voxels of the brain? All right? And the correlations are going to become, those correlations, those Pearson correlations, are the edges in the network that we're going to build. All right. Rest, in this case, is the task condition. All right. It's complicated how they make these images. This is a picture of how it's done. So you maybe start with this area here, right? And you get some time course in this blood oxygenation signal over a period of time. Now you have these two areas. You look at the extent to which those changes in blood oxygenation are correlated with one another. You come up with a Pearson correlation. Right now you can do it for other areas, another Pearson correlation, and so on for all of these areas. These guys are totally uncorrelated. These guys are pretty close. Right? And once you've done that for a while, you can do that for this area and all of these areas. Right? And you can do it for then all of those areas and all of the other areas. So for every, sorry, these should be, these are just blobs for now. But, and I'll explain that in just a second. But the result, as I said, is a Pearson correlation map relating the bold time course in all nodes to the bold time course in all other nodes at this weird 10 to 100 second frequency. How do you choose the nodes? The edges are Pearson correlations. What are the nodes? Well, they do it in two different ways because they want to make sure that the results aren't influenced by choosing one over the other. One thing that you can do is just start voxel by voxel. And then you got 15,000 voxels by 15,000 voxels, and you get the correlations for all of those. Right? Another way of doing it is you start with some nodes that are defined because you think they're likely to be significant areas of the brain. You generate like 264 of them. You draw a 20 millimeter cube sphere around it, and that's what you count as the nodes. And now you correlate those with one another. Right? These are not brain parts. These are not brain parts. They're parts of brains. They're chunks of brains. But nobody thinks that these are the working parts of the brain. Right? They're just spatiotemporal subunits of it. Right? And that's what it looks like when you do the 264 spheres. And this is what it looks like when you map the correlation of each one of those 264 spheres with each of the other 264 spheres. And the reason that you get this nice bright line down here is that that's autocorrelation. That's them being correlated with themselves. And then you can see that inside this thing you get these lit up squares. And those are things that tend to be hanging together with one another. And within those squares you can find other little squares. And those things seem to be hanging together with one another. That is, their Pearson correlation with one another is greater than their Pearson correlation with things outside of them. All right? Not their causal relations, as Simon would have specified it, but their Pearson correlation. And that's important for thinking about explanation. Because now what we're dealing with is a model, a network model, a very useful network model, but what it's representing is this weird time course of bold in this strange frequency that we're interested in each of these different non-working parts of the brain, and we're looking at the Pearson correlation among those things. Those are not the components out of a working model of how the brain does stuff. They're components that we can use to mine for interesting details about how the brain is organized. So the nodes are just chosen for meta-analysis. The edges are correlations in low-frequency bold signals, and nobody thinks that this matrix explains how brains work. I'm not criticizing the neuroscientists. I'm criticizing anyone who would think that what this amounted to was explanatory. Right? Everybody thinks it represents topological structure, but nobody that knows what's going on here thinks that what we're representing is an explanation. Okay? So what is it used for? Well, back to this picture, it's going to be used to discover these large-scale networks in the brain. We've got reasonable ideas about what brain parts are, but above the level of individual brain parts, like what hangs with what in the brain? And not all of these things have to be spatially contiguous. What matters is that they form a coherent system in some way. And the premise underlying this work is that the things that are oscillating with one another in that low-frequency bold signal, in fact, form a unit. That they're oscillating because they're part of a functional unit of the brain. And what this gives them is a way of trying to detect structure in the brain well above, say, the single unit level or above the individual network level, sorry, that's an ambiguous term in this case, above the level of individual synapses, or maybe even an individual brain region, but now gross 10 centimeter like structure in the brain. Okay. What they do is they put that network through a clustering algorithm, and they find the things that hang together. And not all of them are spatially contiguous. So you get things that are, there's got to be a picture here somewhere. This is what you end up getting when you put this thing through clustering analysis. This red and this red and this red, that's a system, right? This yellow, and this yellow, that's a system. And in what sense is it a system? Their bold signal in this frequency range oscillates as one, right? Or more or less as more as one than they do with other stuff, right? And that's meant to be an indicator of the fact that these things are somehow joined. And although this is described as functional connectivity in the literature, that is the most misleading description of what's going on here. There's nothing functional about this. These are correlations. They do not work. They might reflect working, and that's what they hope. But what we're representing is just correlations and stuff. All right. So partly what they're interested in, what I think is really cool, is carving the brain into parts. We could have done it in the way that Brodmann did, by looking at laminar architecture in the cortex or something. But now we've got an alternative tool for coming at this and trying to recognize structure that's not based on that kind of impressionistic model. One way that we can tell when we've moved from one area of the brain to another area of the brain, it's like the supramarginal gyrus to the angular gyrus, which is represented here and here on a certain flattened surface. You move voxel to voxel to voxel, and you say, when does the correlational profile of the voxel suddenly shift radically? So as we're going here, you know, this guy is, this is just it's hard to explain exactly what's going on here, but you can see that as we get to around here, you get a sudden change in the profile, the correlational profile of the signal that we're getting. So basically the idea is you just keep moving until suddenly you find something that's hooked up to the rest, or that's functionally connected to the rest of the brain in a totally different pattern than the voxel that you were at before. And when you get that kind of radical shift, you say, there, we've now moved from one area to the next. Right? That's really useful. Right? We can also use it to compare different brains. The stupid project that I got assigned as just a toy project so that I could learn how to do some of this stuff was to compare male and female brains. I objected strenuously, and they said, just do it. And I said, okay, I'll do it. I don't know what we're going to find, but fine. And lo and behold, nothing. I'm happy to report. Absolutely nothing. But I was able to generate exactly those systems in both the males and the females. I'm happy to report. But we might have been, we might have found something, and then we'd have to tell a story about it. And in fact, that's what they use to study, for instance, diseases. So whether you can find a change in functional connectivity in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease or people with autism relative to controls. And then the thought is that this is a kind of indicator that would point us to where system changes, system differences exist in these different brains. Other thing that's cool is that it might allow you to discover new kinds of causal properties. This is one that I think actually does push in an interesting direction. So it's a premise of this stuff. They look at what they call modular density, which is the number of unique modules contained within X millimeters of a voxel. And so like an area like this has a very high modular density. That is, within this square around it, you have multiple different systems represented there. And the thought is roughly that these are places where these things come together and actually interact and communicate with one another. But then there are other places over here that are more like Texas, lots of nothing, right? And in the middle of that, you don't get a lot of diversity. You just get one big blob, right? And then the prediction is, on the basis of this, that if people have damage here, that their symptoms are going to be way worse than the people who have damage in the middle of Texas, right? And that turns out to be true. That in fact, that people who have the same size lesion in places like this are way better off than people who have even minor lesions to areas like this that seem to just disrupt the whole damn thing. Right? And so now, notice that in classic neuropsychology, what one wants is these really clean lesions that knock out one and only one function that is entirely pure. And what this thing seems to have given us is a way to talk about brain areas that are really functionally important, but not because they've got a specific function, but rather that they're part of like how this whole communication network actually works. A new vocabulary, and patients would be interesting because they show a multiplicity of deficits rather than a focal deficit. So what was garbage data to the old school neuropsychologist now becomes like central data to the people who are doing this kind of work. That's transformative, revolutionary perhaps, but not a model of explanation. Oh, by the way, I can explain using this why people who have damage here have worse lesions than people who have damage there. But the explanation is just straightforwardly causal. In this case, you've damaged a real hub of communication. In this case, you didn't. So the point, network analysis is in this format is a discovery tool. Right? It's used without the pretense of being an explanation. It's a model that doesn't explain stuff. And the analysis reveals possible causal variables. And the causal variables, if real, are possibly explanatory of something. Right? But the network model is not intended to explain anything. It doesn't represent the right kind of stuff. Right? It's used to tame the complexity of the brain, to use a phrase that Wimsatt was fond of. So, are network models explanatory? Well, that depends on what they describe. Right? Are they explanatory in a manner distinct from mechanistic explanation? Well, maybe, but not just because they're network models. Right? We currently have no theory of mathematical explanation for natural phenomena that blocks asymmetries, and when somebody has one, then we can discuss it. Are mathematical and topological explanations of natural phenomena free from causal assumptions? Well, not the paradigmatic ones that people like Lang and Hünemann have given us. Maybe there are examples. I don't want to rule them out. I just think that they have not given us examples. The ones that they have ultimately depend for their causal force on the causal direction. And that was Hempel's curse. So what are they good for, these kinds of models? All kinds of stuff. Identifying parts in the system and discovering systems and describing complexity. Not all patterns are explanatory. Subsuming something under a general pattern is not synonymous with explaining it. The ontic conception seeks to sort explanatory from non-explanatory patterns. The epistemic conception treats all law-like patterns as equal. That's the fundamental contrast that's been going on since the 70s. And I think we have different constitutive standards. Causal views of explanation are the standards for sorting the good ones from the bad ones, and the philosophical debate is about which standards we should accept. I don't mean to be a dogmatic imperialist about, mechanistic imperialist or mechanista or whatever people have called me. I'm actually, like I said, a pluralist about, folk psychological explanations, ethical explanations, mathematical explanations. Big fan of those, so long as we can say what the rules of that explanation game are, and so long as we have an account that sorts the good ones from the bad ones. But it won't just do to say that because somebody invented a new way of representing something, you got a new way of explaining stuff. That's not the philosophical game that we've been involved in since Hempel wrote his classic work in the 1960s. I don't mean to worship Hempel, but he was smart. He had a good idea about what we should be talking about. And I got to thank these guys, especially that guy, Steve Peterson, for helping me out with this. And really, this person, Becky Colson, who's the lab tech in that lab, who actually sat next to me and walked me through how to do this stuff. She was really awesome. But then there were these people like Haoshen Zhao and Tim Lauman and Jonathan Power, who always looks exactly like that, who were there to help me out when I needed answers to different sorts of questions. And I'm very appreciative of their time. So that's where I am. I'll stop.
Thanks, Carl. The floor is open for questions.
At the end, you started talking about some of the ways of utilizing this kind of information to get at what I'll call more causal explanations. Could you can you expand on that a little bit? I think it's really important that the mere connectivity of this sort is not itself showing the causal relationships or the functional relationships. And I like what you called it correlational connectivity.
Functional connectivity.
Rather than, but could you, I think it's quite clear that there are all sorts of ways this could be really useful for getting at explanations.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could say a little more about examples of the usefulness of this kind of information where people have applied it to get results that would elaborate or add to some of the functional stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is taking over neuroimaging.
Okay.
Right? I mean, I think that many people have run into worries. Maybe they've exhausted questions that they wanted to ask with subtraction methods or something, or they recognized that there were various problems in setting up the right kinds of subtractions. I mean, people still do subtractive research. But one thing that's really taking over is this kind of sudden, I mean, I think it was pretty shocking to these guys when they took basically the control data that they've been using for years and now treated that as the primary data. And then suddenly they saw in that data structure that they had never anticipated to see. And in fact, that structure seemed to map onto anatomical distinctions in many places that we already recognized, but in other places it ran roughshod over the anatomical organization. So one example to give you a case of that is that motor and somatosensory cortex right there next to one another, and it turns out that it doesn't divide those. It rather divides both of them into hand and mouth. Roughly, those are the words that we put on top of these things. But now so you've now cut the thing in totally different ways than you had before. Or the one example that I gave where we're doing boundary detection, where you want to know like where exactly does V1 and V2 begin. And the line of Gennari is the way that we would do that with classical anatomy. But now you want to do this not on a piece of sliced brain, but you want to do it like in a awake and behaving brain. You just move you move from voxel to voxel, and when you see the correlational profile of the voxel shift, you say like, aha, I've now moved from one area to another because I've moved from one that has a certain pattern of connectivity to another area that's got another pattern of connectivity. And increasingly, this stuff is being used for clinical purposes, like I was suggesting, that you might try to find patterns of structural connectivity, or to understand development. How is it that the brain changes over time? How do the patterns of functional connectivity change over the course of the life? I mean, this is a way of doing anatomy. Really, I mean, fundamentally, it's an anatomical tool, and a really cool one. And so, have I addressed? Like,
Yeah,
but you could also do things like somebody. What was it? It was just yesterday. I think it was Stefan who was telling me that like, I find this hard to believe, but Stefan's seems like he really knows what he's talking about. That like you train somebody up. You take functional connectivity before you have them learn a task, and then after they learn the task, and suddenly you notice that the patterns of structural connectivity have changed as a result of the learning experience. So I think people are still with this. This is a pretty new methodology. I mean, we're really talking. If it's 10 years old, I think that's an exaggeration, perhaps, but something around 10 years old. And I think people are still trying to figure out the questions that they can address with this methodology. And I've only given you a small sample of what people have started to do. But this really took off a few years ago. And I think it's just completely transforming what neuroimaging is. And I've just tried to give a brief survey, and then just to insist on this claim, just because I think philosophers are prone to this error, that just because you can model it doesn't mean you've explained it, and that models do lots of things. and part of what would be really cool for philosophers is to talk about the very different things that you can do with models, and it doesn't all have to come back to Hempel's concern with explanation, though again, I'm as guilty of explanatory centrism as anyone could possibly be. the discovery uses for me here seem to be what's really, really up front. And I love the fact that it hooks up with like Herbert Simon and Wimsatt's thinking about discovery, and that they're using these ideas of near decomposability in ways that you can actually implement to search through very messy data and find structure in it. And to me, that's just, that you want to know how we deal with a very complex world in science? Here are some tools that are helping us to grapple with really complicated systems.
Could you just expand a little bit about the hand mount? Because that sounds like a very concrete example of having it lead you to insights that you wouldn't have gotten without.
Well, I mean, the point is just simply that when you look at these functional correlations that you end up getting, that the boundaries don't carve up in the way that you would if you did it on the basis of like a Brodmann mount. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you make of that? It could be that you've got an artifact, or there's something that this network method is missing. Or it could be that this is a better way of carving the system into parts. Part of what was really interesting to me is the question, how do you know that your clustering algorithm is delivering on the real parts rather than just delivering parts? And how do you know to trust your clustering algorithm that what it's told you are the parts are the right parts? And part of the way that they do that is by, like I said, seeing that V1 shows up as a thing, right? And if primary visual cortex didn't show up as a thing, you might think, I'm a little concerned about this thing. But you might also say the same about motor and somatosensory cortex. So it's the fact that it does register in certain places that gives us some faith that maybe what it's telling us about these other things is right. And so it's just, I don't have any more detail to give you except that this technique tells us to carve things in a way that's very different than we would carve them if we were doing it on the basis of cytoarchitecture.
I'm sorry to keep.
Maybe we'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah. Catherine.
So I've got sort of a jumble of things that I'll just try to put a question mark at the end of. So I wonder whether the problem with covering law explanations might be that what they use as the rule that demarcates explanation from non-explanation is deduction, and whether there isn't something else that we can keep from them, like whether network models or topological models or mathematical models might have some explanatory value if we use them in the right ways. And relatedly, when you brought up the flagpole shadow example, that made me wonder, where does this directionality come in with mechanistic explanations? And my guess is that it's that you have to go from parts to wholes. And I'm not sure that always works. Sometimes you might want to go from wholes to parts, so maybe there's an issue there. And so I'm wondering whether you think these network models aren't explanatory at all, or whether they just need something else along with them to be explanatory. And to pin this on a specific example, I'm wondering what exactly the reason is why you think the Hodgkin-Huxley model isn't explanatory, or if that's what you think. Because one possibility is just that Hodgkin-Huxley didn't yet know that it was an explanation when they came up with it. And another would be that on its own it isn't explanatory at all, that you need some of the, dare I say, details to turn it into an explanation.
Yeah, okay. Let me start with the last thing and then move back to the first two, if I can. So the Hodgkin-Huxley thing, there's a mistaken, I just screwed up a sentence. The claim that I still stand by from all that work on Hodgkin and Huxley, I mean, that was a messy situation, and it took us something, we were the first people, me and Marcel Weber and Ken Schaffner decided that if we're going to do philosophy of neuroscience right, we've got to start with the core of neuroscience. And what's at the core of neuroscience? Action potentials. And then let's go back and do the history of this thing and figure out what we can say about it. And I think we all made errors in our attempt to understand what that history was and what was important about their achievement. And I occasionally said things that were not to the letter of what I had established. But what I do think I established in those papers and what I argued for repeatedly, and this is a technical point, and it requires some understanding of how the model works to get the technical point. And so I think most people just read, they don't get it, as they read over it and then assume that something else is being shown. Hodgkin and Huxley did voltage clamp experiments, right? And that involved stepping the membrane voltage to a certain level and then measuring the conductance, the current change through the membrane at that voltage, which was a way that they could get at the conductance of the membrane. Right? So what they needed to do to explain an action potential was to show how at different voltages the conductance of the membrane changes. Right? And for that, all they had was the results of their voltage clamp experiments. And in the end, they say, we would love to know how the membrane changes its conductance, but frankly, our techniques won't let us get at that. So what we're going to do instead is just build some mathematical model. And if you look at the mathematical models for those things, they're really inelegant, and they don't care. They don't care about elegance in that. They're just trying to get the best curve fit to the data that they collected in their voltage clamp experiments. And then they say, it'd be really nice if we could explain how the thing changes its conductance, but we don't have anything on that. All we can do is give you a phenomenal description of how the membrane changes its conductance according to this curve. Right? So the point that I took to be established is that they never explained how that happened. Right? They just had a phenomenal description. That's why I compare it to Ptolemy's models of the heavens, and occasionally they make up some stories. They're like, imagine there are these activation particles in the membrane, and a couple have to move this way, and one has to move that way. And I say that's just like epicycles and deference and all of that. It's kind of not to be taken seriously as having any explanatory value. And then there's a sentence in there that I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking at the moment that I wrote it, where I do say something like, so the Hodgkin-Huxley model doesn't explain, I don't think I say that it doesn't explain the action potential, but I say something like that. And what I should say is that it doesn't explain the conductance changes. And that seems to me, and all the arguments about phenomenal models are really targeted at that very point. So that's what I'll say about Hodgkin and Huxley. So yeah, Hodgkin and Huxley, and it wasn't their model that showed this. They knew this before even going into the 1952 paper, that the membrane, that the action potential was dependent on ions, the concentrations of ions, the flux of ions, and they're trying to show that a model that was built out of those components would in fact recover the action potential. Now this brings us back to your first question. Is there something good in the covering law model that we might want to keep? And I think that the answer to that question is yes. I think part of what Hodgkin and Huxley wanted to do with the total current equation that they developed in 1952 was to show that if you had a mechanism that worked on realistic values for the concentrations of different ions inside and outside the cell, and that the conductance changes were as described as discovered in their voltage clamp experiments and described in their phenomenal models of the conductance changes, then you would get an axon that in fact exhibited the voltage changes that are characteristic of an action potential. It's a how possibly model. And having the mathematics allowed you to show that, in fact, it was a necessary consequence of having these parts organized in that way, obeying these laws, that you'll get this kind of change. And that's much better than we can do for most models in cognitive science and neuroscience. That you can actually represent the mathematics of the situation and show that it's a logical consequence of that mathematics, that if things were arranged thus and so, then you'll get everything about the phenomenon that you wanted in the first place.
And that can't be run in the reverse direction with a flagpole to the right hand?
Yeah, what's the, yeah, sure. But now I'm saying that there's an epistemic value in this case of the completeness of your model. But I'm not saying that that makes it explanatory. It's an epistemic virtue of a model that you can demonstrate that the model, in fact, if things work this way, then you would get this. And I don't know how you could do mechanistic explanation without being able to show that if my mechanism were organized like this, then you would get the behavior of the thing that I'm the behavior that I'm trying to explain, right? So, and I don't know how to show something like that without making use of deduction or logic of some sort, because it's a following from, right? But I think this fundamental point that Salmon was driving home with the flagpole and shadow case was that you can have that kind of derivational relationship between things that don't stand in an explanatory relationship. So you can only, it's going to be a subset of those that counts as explanatory, and that's the point of the flagpole and the shadow. And where does directionality come from in my story? I think two places. One is, or maybe at least two. One is the causal relations among the parts of the mechanism, right? And the other one is the constitutive relationship between the whole and its parts. And I think there's an ontic constraint, and we can debate about it. I mean, that's what these top-down causation stories are about. I'm not a big fan, as you probably know, of top-down causation if we understand it properly. But I think it's an ontic constraint on our explanations that the explanations go up rather than down. But because constitution, it follows the relationship of constitution. And in the other case, it follows the relationship of causation. So that's just that's my first pass answer to that question.
Well, you look like you have a question.
I have any number of questions, but I want to hear other people's questions first. I've got dinners. So. Yeah.
So functional connectivity is sort of one of several approaches now for studying brain networks. And another recent approach is effective connectivity, where you sort of integrate not just the functional connectivity data, you bring structural connectivity data to bear on it, as well as the temporal relations. So I'm wondering, does that come closer to a network explanation, given that you're getting some idea of causal structure? And
great, thank you so much. There should be a slide in here where I say there's functional connectivity, or I should start with like DTI kind of stuff, like structural connectivity, which is just like, that's really the kind of thing that Sebastian Sung is interested in, or Lichtman, or whatever. Physically where these things come into contact with one another, and synapse with one another. And then there's this functional connectivity business, which I think is just this Pearson correlation stuff, right? And then there's this thing, the holy grail of effective connectivity, where it's not just the correlations and not just the connections, but the causal relationships among those things. And there, I'm going to bracket this claim, but I'll say there we're moving in the direction of exactly the kind of thing that I want. And the only thing that's keeping me from just saying we're already there when we've got effective connectivity is that you might have a model that represents like all of the causal structure of the brain. And for me, you haven't filtered that by what you're trying to explain. So which of that causal structure is relevant to memory, which of it's relevant to attention, which of it's relevant. And so for me, when we talk about explanation, we're always talking about explanatory relevance to some phenomenon that we want to explain. And so you could have effective connectivity that's still just kind of a sea of causal relations. And what you have to do is prune that sea by a relevance filter. That then focuses on just the stuff that you care about. But you're exactly, there should be a slide in here that does the structural, an Olaf Sporn's slide that distinguishes those three. And I mean, I didn't even talk about like DTI in here. I think that's also just really fascinating stuff. And
yeah, just a follow-up. Do you know?
Oh, sorry. Can I just say one other thing about before? Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. But one thing that's really cool in all of this, we already know that there are areas that are functionally connected in this Pearson correlation sense that don't have any structural connections between them, and then it's you wonder how is. There's a good old philosophical principle that when you find things that are correlated with one another, there should be some cause for that. And you might expect that cause is that these things are actually connected to one another. But they're not direct connections. It might be a really quite circuitous thing that's responsible for this oscillation, or it could be something else. I just wanted to add that. So sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up the question because Sporns is quite explicit in the practical difficulty of determining effective connectivity because of the time lag in fMRI. So I actually use it as an example in my critical thinking class of how you could confuse cause and effect. Do you know of, because you've actually got your hands dirty in some of this stuff, do you know how they deal with some of those practical difficulties in trying to actually determine what's caused? Because that's what we're after, right? In the end, is what is the effective connectivity and how does it go? And it seems to be a really difficult problem, precisely because fMRI has this time lag in it.
Yeah, I mean, so like all of these techniques are going to peter out on us somewhere. And for me, any difficult question in neuroscience is really going to require a combination of different techniques and different ways of looking at the things. And probably any given explanation is going to involve tons of different models that are required to handle different aspects of that mechanism. That's one of the virtues, I think, of the ontic account is that it's not a one model, one explanation relationship. I mean, I don't know where that assumption seems to have come from in people. But so whether you can milk just this kind of data enough to get that sort of causal information is an open question. I do know that people in Mark Rakel's lab at the moment are working on trying to get the temporal order of these things right. And they do what they call a kind of lag analysis on the stuff. Give me a few more years to tell you how that's turning out. And it's just, and I have to just confess that at the moment I don't really even understand what it is that they're doing. I've sat through a couple of talks and I just don't get it. But
I'll ask you for some references after.
Yeah.
So I have a question that's sort of from left field, but I'm kind of, I guess the question is, have I been accepting the Ontic conception all along? Because I've never really thought of
Could you
my
speak
views.
up just a little bit?
So I'm curious whether the view I'm going to describe in a moment is similar to the Ontic conception, because I never think of it in terms of explanation of it. In the philosophy of physics literature, there's a similar track, which is people discover new ways of making reliable inferences about systems that are interesting. Like Bob Batterman talks about renormalization group techniques that physicists have discovered. And then they frame that as there's a new type of explanation. There's asymptotic explanations. Whereas I tend to think, why put that in terms of the explanation literature? What you've discovered is there's a type of inference that you can make that's surprising. In that case, you can make inferences about systems, how they'll behave in your critical points, without having almost any information about the details of the interactions that hold between the constituents. They just have to fall within a sort of class of dynamics that have certain properties. And in some ways, a lot of what you were saying sounded similar to that you're saying, look, the important question is a normative question about what is a good or bad explanation. That reflects on the referent. And here, I would be thinking that the fact that you can make reliable inferences of a certain type reflects the way the world is and something you've, in fact, discovered about it. Mm-hmm. And so that sounds very similar in approach, although I haven't been thinking of it in connection with an Ontic view.
Yeah, so
yeah.
Batterman has recently become part of this more details better crew. So he's written articles claiming that I'm committed
he's just misreading them.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I tried to make that point as persuasively as I can. And I totally, so when I read Batterman, have you written this down? Have you written any of this? Maybe we ought to talk about it, because I read Batterman. I think there's a kind of mistake that people make in philosophy that I think I've made it a million times as well. You've got some interesting people, in contemporary philosophy of science especially, you've got some really interesting piece of science. And you want to share that with a group of people. And then you have to find some way to get philosophers to care about the thing that you want to share with them. And so you reach into the cupboard for some mold that you can jam this thing into to get philosophers to think that you're really talking about something interesting, rather than just reporting something that's interesting for the reasons that it's interesting.
Right.
I think Batterman is guilty of exactly that with these methods. And I think he doesn't have a story about explanation. And if you look at his recent papers on this, he claims to answer questions that would be explanatory, like why are all these systems describable by this equation, right? And he doesn't have an answer to that question. He has a statement, they are, right? And he has a way of finding the equation that applies to all of them.
Right.
And that's really fascinating and important. And we should all be talking about that and excited about it.
Right.
But it's not a new theory of explanation, like it's something else. And when he reached into the cupboard, he just grabbed the old explanation mold and jammed it in. And I think that if he were to rest on the science a little bit more and let it speak to him, think about what it actually is doing, that he would come to a much more interesting and really useful set of theses about how we form generalizations that cover over large numbers of systems, surprisingly, how we form abstract models that are really useful to us. As that's interesting, for me, that's interesting enough. And it doesn't have to take Hempel down, and it doesn't have to take Kitcher down to do that. It's just its own thing, and it's beautiful. But it's this attempt to force it into a framework that it didn't belong in the first place. So I think you and I have a similar diagnosis of what's going on, but it might be a different in the details it might be different about what, but yes, I think you are embracing, maybe you're embracing something
Yeah,
like
maybe.
the ontic conception behind the picture here.
Right.
It's like, it's not a new, it's the same kind of explanation, but there's something cool going on here. Or maybe it's not an explanation at all, it's an inference. It's a tool for making predictions about how the system will behave, but not all tools that are predictive or explanatory. But, and we learned that in 1963 or something, you know, and I just think sometimes people forget that those guys made progress, I think, thinking about explanation. When all those fights with Hempel and Salmon were really instructive. We shouldn't just forget it. It was useful.
How did today's questions compare to yesterday's questions?
Rob didn't ask
Yeah,
any,
yeah.
so we're off to a great start. And,
That's why I didn't ask anything. I was afraid it would be, that's a terrible question.
I thought in general the standard was hard. Please join me in thanking Carl Craver.